Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the new survivor in the All Things Wicked chapter, Sable Ward. The new chapter is here, and it looks like All Things Wicked is the all-around success many players were rooting for. The unknown has gone down a treat, Greenville Theatre is hands down our best balanced new map in years, and behaviour even just at the balance of a ton of killers in this chapter as well. What's not to love? The meme is dead, guys, they actually buffed the pig. But while the reception to the unknown has been generally excellent, there's another very important aspect of the chapter that's certainly been turning heads. The new survivor, Sable Ward, has proven to be hugely popular, and to anyone who's been in this community long enough, that shouldn't be surprising. She's got pretty much everything a new survivor could have to become a popular member of the cast. She's young, female, visually distinct from the other women of the cast, while still being conventionally attractive, and she comes with a new kind of gimmicky perk type alongside one that may or may not turn out to be utterly game-breaking given time. Wait, where have we heard this story before? It's perhaps fitting then, since many elements of Sable's integration into the game mirror Michaela's arrival a few years ago, that her lore picks up directly where Michaela's left off, and provides us with our first ever sequel survivor to an earlier original character. But before we take a look at the ties between Sable and Michaela, we should probably get a sense of what Sable's story is all about in isolation. Let's try to answer the question, who is Sable Ward? Sable was a young woman living in the sleepy town of Greenville, but she doesn't feel like she really fits in there. Her parents are entirely normal, outgoing members of society, and the other young people in Greenville feel like a whole different species. Even as a child, Sable felt, different from everybody around her. She loved getting muddy and weird things like bugs, lizards, and Halloween. She, wasn't like the other girls. Except one. Michaela was Sable's only friend growing up in Greenville, and they bonded over their love of the occult and being just kind of a black sheep in a small town. Sable was always more into it than Michaela was, though. Michaela would flirt with the dark side of the Force, but Sable let herself live in it completely. Whatever Sable did, Michaela would support her. Sable got a tattoo of an occult symbol in a secret place on her body, something the Rule 34 artists are probably losing their minds about right now, but Michaela wouldn't get one herself, although she did help Sable pick hers out. Incidentally, she is modelled with a tattoo on her upper thigh. It looks like the same symbol that was carved onto Pam's hand, Hag's friend from the Tome 5 cinematic for the Hag's lore. The same symbol that Elodie also drew in her lore to enter the entity's realm. This is a really neat little detail tying her back into DBD's setting, and thank you to the porn artist who ripped her naked model in 12 seconds, or else I'd never have found this. And when they'd catch horror movies together at the Greenville Theatre, the discussions that would spark on Sable's radio show would come from a place of companionship. Michaela liked horror comedies, but Sable preferred her gorier, edgier, and all-around darker cinema. So when the Moonstone Cafe they both worked at hosted its horror story competition, Sable pushed for Michaela to write about something called the Unknown, an urban legend that manifested to anyone who thought about it too much. But Michaela had other plans to work on a story with her roommate, who we know from her lore is a guy called Julian. But after that night at the Moonstone, both Michaela and Julian disappeared, and Sable was left behind to pick up the pieces. The unknown must be behind the disappearances, right? So she started to look into previous missing persons cases in Greenville, and callers to her radio station started to point her in the right direction. Many of the town's mysterious disappearances took place at or around the Greenville Theatre, which locals said was built on the ruins of a destroyed schoolhouse where dozens of children died in a fire. This created a fracture in reality, an overlap, you might say, between our world and one populated by horrors and murderers beyond comprehension. Sable was naturally intrigued. She tracked down Ellen, the only living witness to any of the prior Greenville disappearances, who had torn her eyes out upon witnessing the disappearances of her brothers. Ellen told her of something evil lurking in the basement of the theatre, to not go in, and whatever it was had taken both her brothers. So of course Sable went to the theatre and took a look, only to behold the overlap and the entity within. She considers the nightmares Ellen described, the murderers and monsters Michaela wrote about in her story, and thought to herself, yeah, why not? And thus the entity took Sable Ward for its own. So with her lore on the table, we can see that there's a lot going on with Sable. There is a ton of interesting world building in Greenville to explore here. We have the character of Sable Ward herself as a person, and her relationship with Michaela. And I want to begin by saying that I love the idea of a survivor who followed in the footsteps of a predecessor, who the entity separated from their loved one and was left to pick up the pieces. Sable and Michaela make a really cool pairing, read that exactly how you will, and Michaela seems like exactly the right kind of person who would give somebody like Sable a chance as a friend. She's shown throughout both her stories as an enthusiast of subcultures like witchcraft who doesn't exclude herself from socialising outside of that bubble, and that speaks to an open mind that would allow her to be friends with both Sable and other people like Julian, who are presumably a bit more mainstream. Michaela and Sable's friendship is not out of character for Michaela at all. It isn't like we've given a complete loner like Jake a super close best friend out of nowhere. Seeing how Sable puts the pieces together about Michaela's disappearance is pretty satisfying as well, since we know where the story is going even if she doesn't, and it ties in with the unknown to boot. Sable's original suggestion to Michaela was to write a story about the unknown instead of the one she'd end up writing, and initially believed that the unknown was the one that had taken Michaela. Ironically, this makes her pretty similar to Olivia, the main character of the unknown story who assumes that Sable and Michaela's disappearances are the result of the unknown, only to find the entity being behind it instead. Sable's lore also offers us an answer to the question of why the entity seems to be targeting Greenville. First Julian, then Michaela, and then Sable herself, and finally the unknown too, adds at least 4 disappearances from the same place at different times, and Sable's lore provides with a satisfying reason why. The Greenville Theatre was the site of a huge tragedy, dozens of people dying in a fire at a school in the 1920s, with a theatre then built over the ruins. And it's been part of the lore for years now that the overlap between the entity's realm and the real world are most commonly found in places where great tragedies have taken place, where negative emotion pools and eddies like water to create this rip in reality. The Garden of Joy is one such location. It was the site of hundreds of deaths all at once to create the dredge, which you could even consider to be an overlap itself given life. And that created damage in reality which lasted for decades and wound up being discovered by Hattie Core and her brother for the Ravages of the Abyss podcast series. They didn't need to explain why the entity kept targeting Greenville and its residents, but they did. And they did so by calling back to long-established prior lore, so it goes from supernatural to just supernatural. 2 thumbs up from me on this one. So there's a lot to like about Sable's lore in terms of the world building and setup surrounding the character. This is the kind of thing that great survivors are made of. But the character herself is what really needs to stick the landing. And this is especially true for Sable, since the killer she's releasing with isn't really a character at all, but instead a kind of enigma, for curious minds both in-universe and out of it to figure out for themselves. If you're looking for a character to really get stuck into this chapter, then Sable is all you're gonna get, and here's where it starts to go a little bit haywire for me. But before I go into exactly why, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, I want to say thank you for the reception to the last 2 videos I put out. The lore video on the unknown has been one of my best performing videos in years, and my immediate follow-up, the Grandmaster's Guide to Skull Merchant, was a real passion project of mine for months now, and the response has been far better than I anticipated. Granted, there are still some shitheads giving me grief about it because seeing the name Skull Merchant ignites some primal fury in the minds of many people, but they've been largely outnumbered by the huge amount of positive feedback and support I received in the past week or so. So thank you so much for anybody who's watched or enjoyed either video. And if you're interested, I'd love you to take a look at the Skull Merchant guide if you haven't already. It took 3 months to put together behind the scenes, and it shows that the killer has a lot more depth than most give her credit for, so do go take a look if that tickles your fancy. It's very, very long, but it's all time-stamped, so you can pick out what you want. Hope you have fun with it. It's why this video wasn't ready for the chapter's release day. But also, I have a special announcement to make. You might remember a little game called Evil Dead the Game that was abandoned by the developers Saber Interactive in the middle of last year. They cut off active maintenance and development for the game, effectively killing it stone dead. But in true Evil Dead fashion, just because you kill it doesn't mean it won't come back for more. The Matchsticks tournament is an upcoming 3-day tournament for Evil Dead the Game, and I'll be casting for it alongside figures in the Evil Dead community. The tournament will be taking place over 3 days from the 22nd to 24th of March, and I'll be casting for the Friday and Sunday events, so it'll mean a lot if you stop by. It'll be streamed by Caddy and Sassmouth, 2 prominent figures in the Evil Dead community, over the 3 days, and I'll be casting for the Casual Friday and the Wheel of Misfortune Sunday tournament matches. More news closer to the time, so keep an eye on the community post for this channel and join the Matchsticks Tournament Discord, link in the description, for things like starting times and sign-up information if you wanted to take part. Looking forward to seeing you there. Now, let's get back to Sable. The title might give you a bit of a clue, but I struggle to take the character of Sable Ward seriously, and there's a few reasons behind it, but the biggest by far is just that the way she's presented makes her hard to view as a serious character. I'm not the first person to pick up on this, but I'm sure you noticed if you read the lore just how over the top it all is. Like with every character's lore, at least every competently written character, Sable's lore sets you up with a solid understanding of who she's supposed to be in a way that you can easily understand and express. It gives you a strong and clear understanding of who she is, But if anything, it might be a little too clear. Like in the same way that a man with a hair in his soup at a restaurant might send a clear message to the waiter by punching them in the face. Sable's lore, especially the first half, establishes her very clearly as a not like the other girls kind of girl, and the lore is extremely on the nose about it. Just read the start of the story and you'll get what I mean.
Sable figured she had to be adopted. No way was she the progeny of her insanely perky mom and her grinning, golf-playing frat boy of a dad. They didn't understand the first thing about her. No one in Grenville did. Except for Michaela. They were fast friends since first grade. Up until then, Sable had no friends. She wasn't into ponies or dolls or tea parties with teddy bears. She liked bugs, lizards, riding bikes and dirt clod fights. Her favourite holiday was Halloween, and Michaela was the only one who didn't think she was crazy when she dyed her hair purple in 8th grade. Sable's mom was furious. Her dad didn't even notice.
And it just keeps going. I didn't stop at the end. There's a shit ton more of Sable in this story that just hammers home with the subtlety of a steamroller that Sable is just not like the others in Greenville. And by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. Stories about outsiders and subcultures can really be well written when approached properly. I just don't believe that Sable's lore is an example of that. And to show you what I mean, I want to talk briefly about a survivor whose lore manages to nail the outsider narrative, Zorina Cassia. Much like Sable, Zorina grew up as an outsider among her peers, but while Sable was an outsider because she didn't have anything in common with them, Zorina was a second-generation Lebanese immigrant, and that resulted in a little bit of a culture clash. Obviously, being a second-generation immigrant is rather more of a stark and consequential difference than dressing in black and liking bugs, but the basic structure of the outsider narrative remains the same. If Zorina's lore was written like Sable's, we'd be banging on for 3 or 4 paragraphs about how different she is from everybody else and just kind of leave it there. But Zorina's story instead establishes the facts, that Zorina's upbringing and heritage alienates her from her peers, and uses how she handles those facts to characterise her. She starts off rejecting her origins, using a different name and throwing away her foreign lunches, but winds up reclaiming her Lebanese heritage because she realises she'd rather be sincere to who she is than fit in with the crowd. It tells us a lot about the woman that Zorina would grow to become. She's a firebrand, someone not willing to compromise the truth of who she is to appease others, and this sets up her later life as an intrepid documentarian who is similarly unwilling to compromise the truth of other people's stories. Zorina's story takes details about her background and extrapolates them into a natural arc of growth, and that makes her character feel super authentic. She handles situations and grows in ways that feel like a real person would, and this gives her depth. It allows us to take her seriously. Sable isn't given that depth. We know that she's an outsider, but we're barely shown how that affects her materially, and we know even less about how she feels from those material effects. We're told when she dyed her hair purple that her mother was furious but her dad didn't even notice, but was it because her dad was neglectful, or was it because he didn't care and wanted his daughter to be happy? How did Sable feel about his indifference or her mother's outrage? We just don't really know. We're told when she gets the job at the Moonstone that nowhere else in Greenville would hire her, but how does she feel about that? Did Michaela have to drag her to the job interview because Sable wanted to just be left alone, or did Sable ask for the job? How does she feel about the material problems that come with being the black sheep of Greenville? We have no fucking clue, and this has the frustrating effect of making Sable feel very flat, like a one-note character who exists to fit into a stereotype instead of functioning as a whole person. This gets particularly challenging when you realise she's opposite Michaela, who's had plenty of time and story content to flesh her out over the years, and with how much work has been done, especially recently, to make Michaela three-dimensional and pull her out of the TikTok witch stereotype. It kind of puts Sable to shame by comparison. Hell, when she's put opposite Michaela, her story doesn't even make sense, because there's many inconsistencies or just weird questions prompted by Sable's version of events that do not mesh well with Michaela's lore, and it makes Sable's writing feel like even more of a half-hearted hack job. Sable's lore asserts that Michaela supported her in her alt-girl activities but never went quite as far as she did, refusing to get a tattoo when Sable did and preferring lighter-hearted horror comedies over Sable's love of hardcore gore fests. But this stands at odds with what we already know about Michaela. I'm not sure why they felt the need to emphasise that Michaela didn't want a tattoo when her survivor model has multiple large tattoos on it, one on her forearm and one on her waist. So I don't know why they decided to go this route. Michaela clearly isn't opposed to getting tattoos, so why didn't she want one in this case? It's not impossible to change her mind at a later date, just a little bit of a weird writing choice. And the same again goes for her preference for horror comedies over hardcore grisly horror. Michaela's tome has her revelling in the nightmare world of the entity that she visits when she goes to sleep, seeing the horror of the entity's realm and coming out of every night of terror eager to learn more. And the stark horror of her eventual story is a testament to that. There's nothing about Michaela that suggests that she prefers her horror a little lighter. And while it's, again, not necessarily impossible, it's just a slightly strange detail to include when it rails against a little bit of what we already know about the character. And don't even get me started on the Julian problem. Julian, Michaela's roommate and friend in both her base lore and her tome, is alluded to in Sable's lore, but not even mentioned by name, which is odd because he's the most prominent figure in Michaela's lore short of Michaela herself. If anyone's set up as Michaela's closest friend, her confidant in her tome, and the person she trusts to help her write and work, it's Julian. There's no suggestion that Sable even exists in Michaela's lore, because Julian has the role that Sable has in Michaela's life. It makes it really obvious that Sable wasn't a part of Michaela's life naturally. She wasn't there to begin with, but was instead leveraged in by behaviour to try and retroactively tie her into Michaela's life to give her more relevance than she otherwise would have. This is something that could easily have been addressed by giving Sable a role in Michaela's life that Julian didn't fill. Like perhaps she's Julian's sister, who met Michaela through him. Maybe they were close in a different way to Michaela's friendship with Julian. But instead of Sable fitting cleanly into the existing relationships in Michaela's life, she feels tacked on. And it makes the fact that she wasn't part of Michaela's original story really hard to ignore. If I was putting on my cynicism hat for a second, I'd even read this situation as evidence that Sable being part of Michaela's story was introduced late in Sable's design. Because if Behaviour's writing team went into All Things Wicked with the intention of, right, let's make a survivor directly linked to Michaela, then Julian is such an incredibly obvious choice that I don't see why they'd ever have made Sable instead. He's even taken by the entity in pretty much the same time Michaela is, so there wouldn't even really be a reason to write a whole new story in the first place, just retell Michaela's story from a different perspective. The fact that Behaviour had to crowbar Sable into Michaela's story indicates she wasn't originally designed to fit in there, suggesting to me that the first thing they wanted Sable to be when planning her out was not a friend or partner of Michaela, but them starting with the goth girl survivor idea, a trope that was guaranteed to sell like hotcakes, and then work back from there to retrofit their new marketable character into the existing cast and their stories. If I was being really, really cynical, I'd go so far as to say that the choice to tie her into Michaela's backstory didn't come from a place of creative inspiration to make the character the best she could be, because if they had, it probably would have been done more cleanly. But as a calculated sales tactic to capitalise on the existing fanbase Michaela has, who bought her and her skins in large quantities. After all, Michaela has by far the largest and therefore most profitable player base of any original Survivor released in the past few years. So I'm making a character marketed at that same group of people who ties directly into Michaela's backstory. Behaviour maximises the chances of being able to double dip on that market share. But remember, this is just my speculation based on what we know about Sable. It's just hypothetical, so don't take any stock in it. Regardless though, Sable's integration as a character has left a lot to be desired, because while the idea of Michaela having someone she left behind to pick up the pieces of her disappearance is a really strong idea, Sable herself does not stick the landing. She doesn't feel like a natural part of Michaela's world. Her personality is very one-note and stereotypical of her character archetype. Her integration to Michaela's story feels very slapdash in a way that makes it obvious she doesn't fit in there organically, and the illusion of realism that most survivors are presented with is completely shattered. She is obviously an artificial, corporate fabrication, a cartoon character and not a person, which makes Sable Ward an impossible character to actually take seriously. And I kind of love that. See, I've been saying all video that Sable doesn't feel like an authentic person to be taken seriously, but I'm not sure you're really supposed to. Sable reads like an exaggeration, an over-the-top parody of herself, and I've been treating this like a flaw, but what if I've got it all wrong? What if Sable's meant to be exaggerated? What if she's always been a cartoon character? Despite, or even because, she doesn't work as a serious character, she's absolutely fantastic as an unserious one. Let's start with the obvious here. The first half of Sable's lore is incredibly on the nose about the kind of character she is. She's a not like the other girls alt girl who thinks everybody else is just too bland for her, and this starts to make more sense when you realise that her and Michaela have a story set in the late 90s or early 2000s. Think of what the edgy teenager subculture was like in the early 2000s. It was the golden age of Hot Topic and MySpace and fanfiction.net, and this brand new band called My Chemical Romance. They're so cool but you probably never heard of them. It was Scene Kid Paradise. It was Nirvana with Nirvana. And if you were to make a condensed stereotype of young countercultural people in that time period, they'd probably look a hell of a lot like Sable. If the writers of Sable's story are somewhere between their mid-30s and mid to late 40s, I don't know anything that you don't hear, this is kind of just a guess, they were probably about Sable's age during the time Sable's story took place. For all we know, Sable Ward could even be an act of self-parody by Behaviour's own writers, looking back on their edgy scene kid era, and kind of make a survivor based on themselves, or the people they knew during that time. Sable's interest in horror films and how that compares to Michaela's similarly dates her to that time period. Michaela says that she likes horror comedies, but Sable prefers grisly and serious films. What doesn't make much sense from a character perspective for Michaela, is actually a perfect mirror of what horror cinema was like back then. The late 90s and early 2000s were governed by two different kinds of horror media. There was the Scream effect that kickstarted in the mid-90s, where horror dipped into self-awareness and self-parody to maintain relevance, and it satirised the tropes of the 80s. But the arrival of the torture porn subgenre in the early 2000s with films like Saw and Hostel took us to the other end of the spectrum, as it dispensed with self-awareness and levity in favour of just trying to make you feel uncomfortable. Michaela and Sable seem to be on opposite ends of this divide that drove a wedge through horror communities at the time. It's a super authentic portrayal of horror culture in that time period. I'm not just saying that because I'm on Sable's side for this one. The ending of her lore affirms to me that Sable's story was almost definitely written with comic intentions. She ends up at the threshold of the entity's realm and decides to enter willingly because, and I quote, she didn't want Michaela to have all the fun. From a serious perspective, this is immensely stupid. She's already met someone who tore her eyes out because of the horrors that even witnessing this inflicted on her. It should be clear to anyone with even a small amount of remaining marbles left unlost that this isn't fun. This is a terrible idea. But with Sable viewed as a comedic character, this wraps back around to being hilarious because we know what's going to happen to her in the fog. The dramatic irony that we know something that she doesn't makes her suffering darkly funny. And we can laugh at it because we know that Sable isn't really a person. She is a cartoon character designed, at least in part, to be laughed at. This even goes as far as her name. Like, Sable Ward is the kind of name that Sable Ward would give herself. Sable is a very dark brown or black colour, and Ward is like the opposite of a hex, it is an allusion to witchcraft. So if you want to make a dark and edgy character with occult powers, you can't really get a more on-the-nose name if you tried. It's very, Ebony, Darkness, Dementia, Raven way. It's not a name your parents would give you, it's a name you'd give yourself, or more accurately, a name a writer would give you. It's like if Dwight Fairfield was instead called Howard Spineless, or Jonah Vasquez was called Fernando Warcrimes. It makes her read like a character in a bad fanfic, or worse, a J.K. Rowling novel, which shatters her believability but makes her an excellent figure of parody. A satirisation of the edgy self-insert fanfictions popular among young writers at the time, and the ultra-edgy scene kid culture in general. When taken seriously, Sable Ward simply falls apart under the weight of her own over-the-topness. She's treated with the subtlety and nuance of a bulldozer in a church, and the issues integrating her smoothly into Michaela's story make her existence as a narrative and corporate construct instead of an organic character impossible to ignore. However, when her exaggerations are embraced as positives, she actually becomes a pretty solid parody of the goth-adjacent youth subculture of the early 2000s. If the unknown is the creepypasta killer, Sable Ward is the survivor meant to take the piss out of the kind of people who wrote and read them. If Sable was meant to be a comic character, she's a fantastic example of one. But if the intention was to take her seriously, I feel very bad for the writer, because I just spent an entire video treating their sincere efforts like some giant joke, but it's how I feel. And the proof in the pudding will be how Sable's tome in the unknown mid-chapter will handle her. If she's treated seriously, Behaviour have a lot of work to do in painting her into her world authentically and giving her the depth she's lacking as a fairly flat character. But if she's meant to be a joke, I think we could be in for a really fun tome that gets to handle its subject in a totally different way than we normally get. Sable Ward is much a strange addition to the roster as the unknown itself. My first instinct is to call her lore so bad it's good, but I'm not even sure I'd be comfortable calling it bad. I don't know what it's trying to do for sure, so I can't really give a verdict on how good it is at doing it. But regardless of the intention, I think I'll always have a level of fondness for what Sable ended up becoming. I've said before that Jonah, in my opinion DBD's worst written survivor, was a bad joke. but I think Sable is a legitimately good joke, even if she wasn't really meant to be. And that makes her memorable, for better or worse. This game is a different place with Sable in it, whether we like it or not. So I think all I have to say is this. Sable, I think you're right. One way or another, you really are nothing like the other girls.